right, great intro there, but welcome everyone. Welcome to today's session. My name's Eamon. I manage the Toronto Reactor, and we just want to do a couple of quick intros before we kick it off and hand it over to Gwen and Justin. So today's session, it looks like you have an on-site interview. How can I help? It's going to be great. I'm super excited to join in. Couple of notes. If you could please check into today's session. I'm going to put that on the screen there. And put it in the chat as well. It's aka.ms/reactor check-in. The code for today is 14633. All the links that we're going to be talking about and anything else that you need for today's session and further learning, that's all going to be on there. So that would be great if you could do that. The other thing that we want to mention is today's code of conduct. So code of conduct is fairly straightforward. All we ask is that you're considerate and kind to other people who are in the chat, our speakers today. Just be understanding and respectful to all questions and viewpoints. And with that said, we really welcome as many comments and as much communication in the chat as you like. This doesn't mean be quiet and keep to yourself. Please be open. We're all monitoring that as well. And if you have any questions, please let us know in the chat as well. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Justin and Gwyn.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Hi, chat. Things might be a little different this week. Well, actually, obviously are a little different, right? But yeah, welcome to another episode of How Can I Help, where we cover things like cover letters, resumes, phone screens. We covered that last week. And today we're diving into on-site interviewing, but perhaps and most likely a lot more because I have a special guest with me today, Justin. Justin is actually my manager here at Microsoft, and I sort of asked him to be my guest, and more than happy he decided to join me on here. We've got plenty to cover, but also as usual, use the chat. Let us know what kind of things you're interested in. But Justin, hi, how are you? Thank you so much for joining. Very excited for us to be doing. I think this is probably our second stream working.
Yeah, I think we were on a same stream when we did a session for International Women's Day last spring as well. But very happy to be here on your show, Gwyn, and Chloe's show as well. I'm very excited and fun to collaborate with you as well.
Yeah, pretty cool to actually collaborate with my manager. So today's episode, we I guess we'll try to guide the conversation around on-site interviews. I wanted to dive into that actual word on-site, like you mentioned, Justin. On-site really isn't the same as what it used to be, but the reason we kept it sort of in the title is because I guess it's sort of like a standard. But what we mean by on-site is, I guess, the first maybe face-to-face interview, but that could be camera, like most likely Zoom, Teams, things like that. I'm sure some sort of on-site interviewing, like in-person interviewing, is still happening, but not as much as it used to for obvious reasons. But yeah, that's what we mean by on-site interviewing. And Justin, why don't we kick it off by sort of just talking a little bit about what your current role is in this interviewing process, like what kind of things you do and that.
Yeah, thanks, Gwyn. So I've been a Microsoft employee for, I think, 16 years now. I also previously did some consulting work with Microsoft or for Microsoft prior to that. And have been a manager for about 7 years now. So I'm certainly not the expert of all things across a company that has hundreds of thousands of people or represents the full diversity that is Microsoft. But I have had a chance to have many different experiences and met different people through the interviewing process. And certainly through my years at Microsoft have also, I've applied to roles within Microsoft and such. And so have had the experience being that person who is interviewing on an on-site interview as well. And I got some good stories to tell about that. Well, mostly it's gone well, but certainly some good learnings and things that I would love to share with all of you as well. In my day job, I manage a team of cloud advocates, including Gwyn, our New York regional cloud advocate as well. We've been actually actively hiring right now as well. We've almost hired everyone on the team, which is a very exciting milestone to see this team come together as well. But all of that to say is I have been recently working a lot on hiring and meeting people and that. So I'd love to share what I've learned.
Yeah, that's awesome. might be a little obvious, but I actually interviewed with Justin. Like Justin, we did a couple of conversations and actual interviews back in May, I believe, April,
Yeah, yeah,
May-ish time is right. So,
yeah.
it was quite an experience, and I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more of that too. But let's talk a little bit about the actual on-site interview experience in 2021, and what do you think are sort of like the major differences from, I don't know, interviewing prior to the pandemic? Let's put it that way.
Yeah, so I think first of all, I mean, speaking for my experience within Microsoft, most of our interviews have become a video conference of some sort, usually on Microsoft Teams, occasionally in person with the right safety protocols as well. But speaking for myself, every interview, all informationals and in those types of interviews have been virtual. And so it does change the dynamics a little bit. The fundamentals of interviewing, getting to know someone, understanding their qualifications and their skills and their experience. All of those things matter just as much in a video conference as they do in person. Maybe the biggest difference is that in a on-site interview, perhaps your pants need to match your shirt in terms of color coordination, whereas on a camera, it all looks professional or business casual up top, but you could wear sweatpants or jammy pants if you want, if you like. I mean, that obviously is a joke and such, but still, like, the fundamentals are still there. That the on-site interview is about getting to know the candidate, and not just Microsoft interviewing you, but you also really determining if it's the right fit for Microsoft in this case, or any other company that you might interview for as well. It is a two-way street, because I've certainly learned that you have clues during the interview that when you go to work someone and you hire someone, those same things are the dynamics that you work together on. And so it's really, really important for you as the prospective candidate to pick the company that you want to work for, and that you believe you'll be successful in as well.
You mentioned a couple of great things that I want to dive into more. And Chloe and I stress the fact that interviewing is two-way things. And oftentimes we, especially when we're getting started and, trying to land the first gigs in tech or whatnot, it's sort of easy for us to kind of sort of dismiss that, and we'll like sort of take whatever happens and things like that, and whatever role is available, whatever company is available, even if we might find some red flags and things like that. So it's great to hear from the hiring manager perspective that you got to pay attention to these things, where it's like you're also going to be spending a lot of your time at this job. You got to make sure it's a proper fit both ways. But I'm sure we'll dive into a little bit more of like what kinds of things you would recommend asking and stuff like that. But before that, you also mentioned dynamics and like how you can sort of get a feel for your your interviewing process as it's going, and as you're talking and picking up on signals and cues and things like that. But what do you think goes into sort of successfully preparing for, I guess, your first on-site or your first person-to-person or like face-to-face interview?
Yeah. I think when I say dynamics, I really mean about the communication that takes place between the interviewer and the interviewee in this case. And really, I think the goal in that conversation is for you as the interviewee, the person who's the candidate, is to have an opportunity to share your best self. I use the word authenticity a lot. Gwyn, you've probably heard me say that word a lot through our one-on-ones and different conversations. But I think you really want to have a chance to share your best self with that interviewer, and communicate not only the sets of experiences and skills that you have. Those are obviously fundamental to being qualified, being the right fit for a role, particularly technical roles, but also business functions and that. But equally, if not even more importantly, and I'll get to the more importantly in a second there, you have a chance to showcase your own communication style and really display how you think. And it turns out, in my opinion, that not only what you say is important, but how you phrase things and how you say things in an interview, in many ways, can really be very telling and very exemplary of your communication style and even sometimes your underlying values are some of the things that you hold as yourself. And so part of the interview process is not only to take your technical qualifications or your business qualifications, but also to say, how do you build on those, and how do you share, and how do you articulate yourself, and why you want to be part of this team or to be part of this company, and that as well.
I agree 1000% with, it's not just what you say, but how you say things.
Yeah.
And you and I were talking about how, in the context of preparing for sessions and streams like that, we tend to practice a lot. And I know I personally, for interviews, practice a lot as well, in terms of because, we all know there's sort of a set of standard questions that get asked. Whereas, for example, how do you work with teams, and how did you find this role, or tell me about a project where you had issues, how did you resolve them, things like that, right? So there's sort of these set of standard questions that you get asked, and you can practice them. And I think people might think it might be a little sort of counterintuitive to practice being authentic, but when you go into an interview and you're sort of put on the spot, or maybe you get nervous or something like that, you're gonna really be thankful that you took the time to practice the things that you were going to answer, so you have less stress and less pressure when you actually have to go up and answer those kinds of questions. I don't know, Justin, if practicing and things like that is something that you do, or sort of what sort of things you do to sort of feel a little bit more relaxed or a little bit more prepared.
Yeah, it is. And it might be surprising to some people, even my own coworkers, who sound like, I always sound like I'm polished or know what I'm talking about or that. But I actually get really, really nervous, and have gotten unusually nervous for interviews in the past. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do this session with you, Gwyn, is just to share that I do practice in the mirror, or I record myself when I'm, conducting interview. That means that I am the candidate that's interviewing for a role in Microsoft or in other places like that as well. And the practice helps me kind of not have the nerves as much, because what I kind of specifically do is I try to think of if my life is a set of stories, whether it be my personal life or my professional life, I'll certainly say I've spent a lot of hours through my professional life, and I've collected a lot of stories, and many of those are incredible stories, and some of those have been stories of growth and learning, and some of those have been somewhere in between. And so when I'm preparing for an interview, particularly on site or virtual, where you don't have a note sheet or something, you're not looking down at a note card, having a collection of stories in your head that when an interviewer asks you a specific question, my pause, it's my or that's a good question, whatever your transition phrase is as you're thinking before you want to answer. The way I personally think of it is I'm pulling from the library of my stories and taking that opportunity to share a story about myself. Indeed, I think that's actually, it may not work for everyone. Everyone prepares differently. But certainly for me, that helps me present my best self or share what I feel to be my authentic self, because it comes forward in stories. And who doesn't like a good story either?
Absolutely. I thought of this question because you've mentioned you've been at Microsoft for years now, and I'm sure you had a career prior to that as well. But I'm curious, just because I haven't been in the field too long, what interviewing looked like and how different it is from, let's say, I don't know, when you just started to what it looks like now in terms of things you get asked. Or do you think that sort of the technical interview process is pretty much the same, except for the fact that now most of it's on camera?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's my transition as I'm thinking about what I want to say there. No, that's a really good question. I hadn't really thought about that one before. But I would certainly say, and again, I represent my own point of view on it. I think everyone who works at Microsoft will be different or that. But I would say the biggest change that I have observed over time is that in the Microsoft interview process, we put a lot more focus on the sort of human skills and values and culture than my interview into the company was very, very much about what have you done, right? What have you accomplished? Where do I believe you can add value immediately? And that's not to belittle the great people that hired me in or that of the process. I think it's a function of our own evolution as a company and as culture, and being more mindful of a wide range of perspectives and a wide range of ways that people can add value and make an impact in the company and such. And so I think I've learned over time that I place an incredible amount of value on a person's ability to demonstrate a growth mindset, or to show that they are learning or they're on a journey. And in fact, skills and qualifications are super important. That's probably the previous session that you did with the phone screen or with the resume, is that once you have that as a hiring manager, you have the foundation of a technical background or a person that has a set of life skills that you're looking to be part of the role. But the on-site interview is much less about those sort of technical details and much more about how you communicate that and kind of showing your own communication style as well.
I would agree with that. Someone had mentioned in the previous episode in the chat that there's a lot more focus on culture now within the technical interview, or with a role within a interview for a technical role, or a job at a tech place or company, which I think is great when we think about getting more people into tech and diversity and inclusion and those things like that, because I think everyone can learn different technical skills, but in terms of like communicating and actually being someone who is great to work with and a team player and all those kinds of things, that takes a little bit more effort to not only show but to figure out, but also to like grow and things like that too. I'm sure I know you've interviewed a bunch of people, but I'm curious if you've seen sort of mistakes or like common mistakes or patterns or sort of maybe easy things to correct in terms of the candidates have done during interviews?
Yeah. I think probably the biggest thing that I notice that is most common. So if the assumption is this is most common, so if you are preparing for an interview, this is a good thing to practice in that. But usually when someone has nerves or that, which is completely normal, again, it's pretty common for me to have that as well. The first thing that a person unconsciously forgets, perhaps, is to listen to the interviewer. And so you, in a quest to be able to share as much information as possible about yourself, you end up, one ends up, going for quantity over quality, right? Which is trying to get all the sound bites in, trying to restate a lot of the things that may already be on the resume. And those are important. Again, I don't want to say that your experiences that's on that piece of paper aren't valuable. They are. That's why you have earned this opportunity to speak and form a connection with the interviewing panel and group of interviewers. And so instead, it's take time to listen, and just remember that person on the other side, particularly on site, but also virtual, is a human being, and they want you to be successful. In fact, I kind of bridged to the previous question a little bit, Gwyn, but the other thing that I certainly have learned a lot as a hiring manager is to change our attitudes and mentality over time from a sort of like a screening out, where I am asking questions to rule out someone or to say, oh, you're not fit for this role, or it's not a good fit, or things like that, to a much more inductive, I'll call it screening in, or I think that's probably a term that other people across Microsoft have used as well. And so remember, we want to hire someone. We're giving up our time, professionally speaking, because we believe that you might be the right person for this role. And so take that time to form a conversation with us. And that means listen, look for those nonverbal cues. Sometimes they can be telling if an interviewer is distracted or is asking more terse questions. Maybe that's an opportunity for you to expand a little bit more and take that as an opportunity to grow. But ultimately, you're forming a connection with a fellow human being, and so that's far more important, because that piece of paper and all your skills and qualifications will always be there as well.
That's interesting that you mentioned the perspective from a hiring manager and how you would encourage sort of the screening out, screening in kind of concept. I'm curious I mean, I'm sure there's more people who are actually interviewing versus interviewing for roles instead of actually doing the interviewing. But I'm curious to like if there's any advice for other hiring managers that may or may not be watching or at some point watch this that you'd want to provide besides like the already amazing the statement that you just made.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I have learned is to trust my interviewing panel for a role. And for those of you who may not be familiar, in Microsoft, oftentimes an on-site or virtual interview where you're meeting people directly involves a group of interviewers, typically 4, but that differs from country and region and other job roles as well. But I have learned that usually as a hiring manager, I have already reviewed the candidate's resume. Sometimes I might also look at their social media or other speaking if they've done. If we're interviewing for cloud advocacy, Gwyn, I had a chance to look at your channel in GPS and YouTube as well, made for GPS as well. And so it was really cool to get a sense of what Gwyn does in public for tech and tech learning. And so those are all, I think, indicators. But more importantly, once you get to the interviewing phase, I really want to trust these fellow interviewers because they're providing a different perspective than maybe what I have. You know, generally by the interview, like I've decided, I think this person's pretty good. I would feel comfortable with them being on my team and would be great. And so really the screening in process is also giving the opportunity for, in this case, 3 other individuals to share their perspective having met this person. And, you know, I think over time I've been surprised and there have been moments where, you know, interviewers have been able to also kind of share things that maybe I missed or even unlocked opportunities for people that I thought, well, I'm not really sure if this person is quite ready for this role, maybe a couple years down the road with more experience and that type of thing. But then I've also had interviewers say, no, see the coachability of this individual. I believe this person would come in the first 30, 60, 90s and learn those key things that you might have some concerns. And so ultimately, I trust my interviewing panel, and it really makes a difference. So if you are that person who is a candidate and you're interviewing with 4 different people or the other number or whatnot, just remember every one of those interviews count. And I would say the interview with the people other than the hiring manager probably counts even more because you know, in this case, I've already had a chance to meet you. It's these other people that are meeting you for the first time.
That's fantastic. Hopefully there are other hiring managers out there listening and they take on that advice. And I wanted to sort of take a second to reflect on my own interviewing process here at Microsoft. But before that, I wanted to ask you, I'm sure when you got started, you faced a lot of rejection. And if you could give yourself advice to sort of maybe process that a little bit, because, you know, landing that first role is hard, really hard. And that's like the time in your professional career where you're going to face probably the most amount of rejection. And oftentimes it could feel maybe unfair or you're confused or you feel like you're not going to make it and things like that. But now that you're, you know, you've established your career and if you could look back and sort of give yourself some advice or give yourself some sort of message, do you have anything to mind that you would say?
Yeah, I think some of the things that I've talked about already are some of my own lessons and things that did not go well. I will be the first to say I have been rejected for jobs before in Microsoft and outside of Microsoft. And I think the reason why I say that just so directly is because I want everyone to know that we all go through this, and including hiring managers and people who are on interviewing panels have themselves also been not selected for a role. So, you know, for me, like this is part of the professional and the human experience is going through that and bouncing back and using moments to learn from that. And in fact, that's what I would say I've learned the most of is some of the times where I have not been selected for the role have been the times where I've gone back and maybe played through the conversation in my head and said, you know, gosh, I really feel like I spoke in such a way that really related with this person. Why didn't I get the role? And unfortunately, sometimes you'll never know because sometimes it can be difficult to get feedback directly from the interviewing panel and such. And so I think for me, it's usually going back to, did I take the time to listen, as mentioned? Did I take the time to really understand what this job was about? Or was I mostly spending my time talking about myself or what I have done in that? And usually where perhaps I wasn't selected for the role, it became that there was ultimately a mismatch between what the role was really asking me, or what the team was really asking me, and then what I was ultimately communicating as well. Classic example for me, I'll say, was I once interviewed for a really, really deeply technical role in engineering, like something that was like I had not really coded in the programming language that they were using at the time. I certainly learned it later, which was C#. So this was many years ago. But I think to some degree I had a little bit of that sort of imposter syndrome, that like I should be deeply technical and I should know this, and I can do anything, I can learn it. But also learned really quickly that find the types of roles that really fit you best. And there's so many great roles in tech out there. The chances are you can find something that you can learn from, but also be able to show up as your best self too.
That's awesome, and hopefully it's reassuring to people in the chat or people who are interviewing to know that I really don't think there's anyone in the field who hasn't been rejected at least once, right?
Yeah.
So at least we all have that in common. I really love this comment by Kathy, and I want to sort of go through a couple of messages we've gotten here in the chat. But if I could tell my past self anything, it would be, it's just a conversation for everyone to learn more about each other. And I think this is really important to highlight. But also, again, because a lot of this sort of content is I guess a little bit more relevant to beginners, and we tend to sort of like lose value in ourselves just because we're like, we need to land that first role, we need to land that first job, or whatever it might be. But understand that who you are as an individual will always be valuable, no matter what level, no matter what role. So if you can present your absolute best self at any level, and you could be comfortable and confident in who you are and what you bring to the table, that's always going to be a plus. Remember that.
Yeah.
Here's a little side note for you, Justin. Is that Mount Evans and Echo Lake in the photo behind Justin?
Yeah, I saw the chat window. I was thinking I was going to say it, but I'm glad you brought it up. And that is actually Mount Rainier, that is in Western Washington of USA here. And it's something near and dear to me. It's an area where, and it's totally relevant for this live stream as well, is that anytime I face adversity or something may not be going as well as I would have wanted, particularly in my career as well, Mount Rainier has always been near and dear to me. And so it's a place where it's about an hour and a half away from my house, and I can go and just walk amongst the trees and the mountains there. And Reflection Lake is where you can see the mountain reflecting off the lake there. And it's a place where I go to reflect. And in fact, true story, I have done that for actual interviews, or when I decided to look for a new role in my career as well. So that's why I put it behind me in my room here, is that it's very special to me.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's interesting that you bring that up. I know I wanted to dive into a little bit more reflection on my interview process, but I have one more question for you. Have you ever been able to use things that more my interest, like for example, I know you're really big into nature and hikes and things like that. Have you ever been able to use those and sort of talk a little bit more about those kinds of things that interest you that aren't necessarily tech related in interviews? Do you recall any situations where it's like really helped you and things like that?
Yeah, it's a great point, especially in the spirit of what we're talking about, is that oftentimes interviewers are used, oftentimes we will have interviewed many people if we're interviewing not for one position, but for many positions. For example, I've been part of the summer internship program where I was part of a I'll call it a blitz of 16 interviews back to back to back and such. And so at some point, technical qualifications are really important. Again, don't get me wrong. But sometimes that sort of personal side or the metaphorical side of how you apply things in nature or hobbies or passions, sometimes those can actually be the difference maker in sharing your authentic self with a person who is interviewing you, particularly if it's relevant to the role. But it can also be indicative of your work ethic and how you apply problem solving. For example, like one of the things that I have used in an interview or spoken about is that I love to garden. And it's like, why is gardening something I discovered? And a lot of it is because it's so analog. It's like my anti-tech of, of course you can get an IoT system and measure pH with your Raspberry Pi and all of that, but my gardening is incredibly low tech because not only is it a way where I can reflect and kind of move out of behind the screen, but it's also an area where it gives me just incredible joy to see flowers come up in spring or something do well, or to grow a pumpkin and then carve it or things like that. And so sometimes those stories do matter in an interview because it shows that you're applying yourself to more than just work, but also it gives an interviewer the chance of kind of seeing your whole self as well.
Exactly. And remember that we're having conversations with other people, and we never know what kind of interests they have, or if we have anything in similar or anything in common. I think I've told this story before on this series, but for my interview into my sysadmin gig, which eventually turned into cloud engineering, which introduced me to this world of Azure and all those kinds of things, they had asked me, like, what kinds of books are you reading, or like what kinds of things do you do, like to read, but not necessarily like tutorial wise. And I mentioned that I was reading this book called The Phoenix Project. And it so happened that exact moment when I was interviewing, my then hiring manager was also reading the book at the same time. So then we had sort of this back and forth about the plot, which characters we liked, what things we saw in common with other roles that we've had, and all those kinds of things. And I got hired for not just for that reason, but for a bunch of other reasons. But then I asked my manager then, like, hey, did that sort of like help me in the process? And he mentioned, yeah, it definitely helped you stick out because it told me that you're interested in what you do, but not just in like to learn the technical skill set, or not just like on the job, but like outside, you're sort of seeking to learn more about the field in other ways. So I just wanted to throw that story out there and sort of tell people that, yeah, you never really know what's going to strike up a conversation. Don't like sort of like put yourself in a box either.
Cheese Bacon in the chat window says, you got hired because you're amazing, Gwyn. And I just want to say that is so very true. I think it's kind of fun to I think this might be one of your questions, but I'll just lead right into it, Gwyn, too. Is like, one of the reasons why I hired Gwyn was she took the time to ask questions about culture and growth mindset, and she was talking about what she was learning, and it didn't have to necessarily just be about a specific technical topic. It was a leading indicator that let me say, I bet she could be the right person that be a lifetime learner. And that's, I think what we look for at Microsoft and such. And so, Gwyn, you are amazing.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just expand on the sort of the personal things or hobbies too. Is it's not just about whether I like what you like, or that you and I share a hobby, although those are great stories, and that is that I look at hobbies or personal aspects of that, whether it be on social media or in your resume or what you choose to share in interviews. I look at that as symbolic of who you are as a person, and what you desire, what you love to pursue, and such. And so it doesn't matter if I share that exact passion. In fact, perhaps no one can share all hobbies or passions. That's what makes the diversity of people so amazing, is that we have so many different things that we love. But it's a conversation starter, and so do consider including that, particularly if it comes up naturally in the conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. Actually, you led into that question of like, I wanted to ask, like what kinds of things I did well during the interview process. Yeah. People know that I'm sort of not, like I've shown my resume, my cover letter on here. I've told like stories that have been rejected. This is all on my YouTube, mistakes that I've made, all kinds of things. I'm very sort of like, I like to let people know the things that I've sort of been through in my career, and mistakes that I've made and things that I've done correctly. And then you mentioned of speaking about culture and things like that. And you mentioned like listening, which is, I think, something that we often don't do, or I feel like we focus so much on preparing beforehand, where we get lost the fact that things can, and the interview can actually go differently. And if you're not actively listening and sort of taking a mental note, or maybe even having like a piece of paper or something where you just write down things that you want to like ask during the end of the interview, or when there's a Q&A, or however the dynamic is, I think you're really doing like a disservice to yourself, where you're not getting the most out of the conversation that you're having. Whereas if it's not like a two-way thing, if you're just answering, you're really not going to get the most out of it. Do you feel like I don't know if you have like any sort of like questions that stick out to you that people have asked have like made the interview experience like way better, or things like that?
Yeah, I think with the advice that I might give, and you can get, you all can get many different opinions from hiring managers out there, because I think this is one where some people will differ on it. But I tend to personally appreciate more specific questions. And let me unpack that a little bit. I really want you to have done some research on what the job role is about. So if a hiring manager posts, particular keywords or proper names, like, the current program that you would be running, or the current product that you would be working on, do your due diligence and go out and Google or Bing those, and really spend a few minutes really understanding the product or the program or the set of skills or competencies that you would perform. Because most importantly, that allows you to ask more specific questions in the interview. And so you don't need to go to your notepad to do that now, because you have that knowledge. You can ask that, I'm really trying to nail that serverless job, and you understand what did Microsoft just announce at Ignite in serverless compute. And that shows that you are informed, that you want to pick up as soon as you start enroll and dive in more. And so traditional questions sometimes you'll hear is, how do you measure success, or how do you define culture in your team, in a global team? And I happily field those questions. They're certainly relevant questions and good ones. But if you can be more specific, so I was researching a little bit more about the future of serverless, and I noticed that you have C# and a JavaScript SDK. But your Java SDK it just came out in the last 6 months, or it's in preview. I was wondering if there's an opportunity to be able to grow that, or what is the status of that? And I think sometimes those sort of specific things, I think, can help. If the interviewer doesn't want to talk about that, or there's some form of disclosure where they cannot, that's understandable. But at least it shows that that you are specifically asking the types of questions that are relevant to the job role that you're seeking.
Yeah, I think the concept of tailoring what you show or what you talk about throughout the entire, I guess, hiring process is very important. We've spoken about this in terms of like resumes and cover letters, and then phone screens and all these kinds of things, because you might have tons of experience, but not all of it is relevant to what your role that you're going to, right? And you only have so much, like, let's say an interview is like an hour or something like that. You only have so much time. You're not going to start with absolutely everything and expect to cover it as well. So I really like the reminder to tailor and to really do your research, and to, you got to put in effort, and you got to be able to also show that you've put in effort. And if you only have an hour, or whatever it might be, or 2 interviews, 1 interview, whatever the process is, you got to make the best out of it. Put your best foot forward. And in order to do that, you definitely gotta prepare here. We've got a couple other questions in the chat that I wanted to dive into before we continue with these questions. I think we went up here. I just wanted to address this one here. If we're going to touch on salary negotiation process in this session, I think this could be a session topic on its own that I could probably cover with Chloe, because I think there's a lot going on here. Justin, I don't know if you had any insight onto this particular topic question.
Yeah, I can lend some light to this one. And again, different hiring managers may differ, and in case even organizations in Microsoft may differ in this. But generally speaking, in my experience, the salary negotiation is something that happens during the offer phase of an interview, and that's usually after the sets of interviews. And so there's kind of, generally my recommendation, there's a time to talk about salary at the informational stage. That is when you're first getting to know a hiring manager, just kind of understanding, what general expectations are. Those are fair questions because let's face it, we want to be compensated for our work and professionals. And so I think it's appropriate to bring that up. But once you get into the interview loop itself, that is when you're actively interviewing with the hiring manager in the formal process, as well as the 3 or 4 or other interviewers that you may. Generally speaking, I do not recommend that you spend a lot of time on salary in those discussions, because the purpose of those discussions is to really get to know you as a candidate and see if you are the right fit for the role, and vice versa, as mentioned earlier. And so once that occurs, then at some point the hiring team makes a decision about whether to extend an offer to someone. That is the moment that you want to have salary-related discussions, because at this point that team, they want you to come work for them. And so you are in a good, favorable position to then ask about salary and ask about expectations. And generally speaking, recruiting or other resources that will work with the hiring team will also help just kind of get your expectations on that as well. Again, it differs from country, location and team and stuff, but generally, especially if we're talking about the on-site interview, which is the subject of this stream, that is the time I do not recommend that you discuss salary.
Yeah, but I think there's so many other things. Not to say that salary isn't important, but there's so many other things that you probably use that time for, and there's time allotted for like the salary discussion throughout the process as well. What I will say, and I see there's more salary questions, so I'm going to definitely bring this up to Chloe so we could get a session going on this topic. But I will say is that there's a lot more info out there in terms of, what's the market, like what's the salary in where you live and those kinds of things. And, there's so many tools out there that you can do your research so you're informed and you don't, when you're asked like, what's your salary range or what's your expectation, things like that, you're not sort of like blindsided. So do your research. It's out there. I guess that might be one of the biggest differences prior, like interviewing maybe like 20 years ago is now, like, I feel like candidates come in a lot more informed, or at least have the ability to come a lot more informed in terms of that. How I think we might be able to answer this one. How long is a typical on-site interview at Microsoft?
Yeah, there's been a slight difference in this. Historically, it was 1 hour, so 4 by 1 hour sessions, typically with a break in between. As we've moved into the pandemic, I've seen in most cases the culture be about 4 by 45-minute virtual interviews. And the whole idea there is that it's a little bit less time, but we're on video camera. We understand that can be fatiguing, particularly for a person that is taking multiple interviews during the process. And so trying to give you all a little bit more of a break in between those sessions as well.
Yeah, that was the format that I did, 4 by 45, which in my opinion, it went by so fast, but I was also extremely nervous. So I had no concept of time. I wanted to ask you, if I guess in tech in general, and this isn't specific to Microsoft, would there be anything that you would want to change in terms of the interviewing process? Yeah,
I thought about this one, and I think probably the biggest thing, other than what I spoke about earlier, about that we have chosen to emphasize growth mindset and learning orientation and culture a lot more in our interviewing process, and that has to do with the questions that we ask and that as well. But the other thing I would say that I think the tech industry is starting to fully discuss and debate a little bit, I would say, and again, there are differences of opinions, but I personally don't think that a formal technical screen where you need to answer a specific problem that is in common for all people. There are some areas where that can be important, like if you are trying to interview for many software engineering positions. I understand a technical problem can be an appropriate way to understand a person's competencies and such. But I think that in many cases, a same or similar can be, one can be brought out of a candidate by asking them a series of questions directly that are in context as well. And so I think, again, if it's something that I personally could change, again, people will differ on opinion, but I think that I would spend more time in that finite time we have to get to know a candidate, asking them questions and developing that rapport and understanding of their skills, than sort of a traditional technical screen set of questions.
Yeah, and I think it's a good time to bring up things like GitHub, or maybe somewhere where you have ways of documenting projects and
Yes.
things like that, and where you can take the time to provide the at GitHub you could use a README, and you could even use that as your own practice, like, oh, this is how I could explain my solution or what I built, what I used, what issues I had encountered, and then when you go to a technical interview, you have sort of these examples of like real life things that you've actually built, versus being asked some random, I don't know, algorithm or something like that. It has its place. Yes.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic point that I should add to that too, is the reason why I think that a sort of traditional technical screen question may not be as relevant as it used to be, is because most hiring managers have done our homework, and we are looking at your GitHub repo or your social media or your LinkedIn for indicators of your technical background. And so one of the first things I do is go to a GitHub repo, because if you're contributing to open source or you did your class projects in GitHub, that is a really, really clear indicator of technical background and technical, what did you focus on? What programming language did you write in? All those things can be inferred in some way. And I will ask those questions in the interview just to validate my own understanding of what I saw. But it makes a big difference, which means, perhaps a specific technical screen question isn't as needed if someone has a beautiful portfolio of projects on GitHub.
I will say, people don't just copy paste things also, and only put on GitHub what you're comfortable to explain it, because you never know when you might be asked something, right? Yeah. I did want to just sort of finish on a more like a fun, I guess, question, but I'd like to know a little bit if you have any sort of nightmare interviewing stories as someone who's being interviewed or as someone who's done the interviewing, and then also on the flip side, like if you had any like best experiences that you want to share.
I'll tell you another story of one where I did not get the role. So my nightmare story is that I was particularly nervous for this one. It was a little bit of a stretch, but I was in the Microsoft cafe and I chose to eat a big old granola and yogurt thing about 8 minutes before the interview. Anyway, someone must have put a rock in that granola or something, but I chipped a tooth with about 8 minutes to spare for an on-site interview. And I mean, like, took the molar half off. It was a bad day. And so I didn't know what to do. So obviously I went to my interview, but the whole time the interview, I was going, I was like, using trying to, how you feel like when your tooth, something changes in your mouth, and like,
yeah,
you lost a tooth when you were a kid. So the whole interview, I was my nervous tick, if you will, was that I kept, running that brand new gap in my tooth. And so finally, about halfway through the interview, the hiring manager goes, "What is wrong?" I was like, "I'm sorry, I chipped a tooth. I can't handle it. It's like, I could barely talk. It was bleeding. It was pretty bad." So that was my nightmare interview, is that I tried to make it through an interview. I'd love to say that I got that role and I just powered through, but unfortunately, that wasn't the case. The nightmare on the other side as an interviewer is I have had a couple individuals over time present, in some cases, like a 40-slide PowerPoint deck during an interview, and it's an interesting approach to it. I think it comes from a place of sincerity where that person wants to communicate the full set of information that they've accomplished, and that. But in a sense, that's kind of what the resume is for. And so the PowerPoint deck places the focus on the deck and away from perhaps the person that is presenting. And the purpose of the interview is to get to know the person not the information just as well. And so I would certainly recommend, don't come in with a PowerPoint deck. Perhaps don't show pictures of all your coworkers in your PowerPoint deck. It's really about you in this case, and the moment is yours in that. Other ones that have come up over time is just people's tone and posture. I had one individual that I was part of a panel, so that person was more senior than myself in terms of their years of experience and their role. But they made me feel like that I was perhaps, earlier in career or less senior than them. And that's not a good feeling when you're trying to establish a rapport with someone. So regardless of how much success one has in their career, always come from a place that you're just trying to get to know other people and honor them and honor their contribution, and let it be about the quality of your ideas and your thoughts, regardless of your career achievements and things like that. Other ones, I highly recommend do not lead with the "I hate my boss" right now. I don't doubt that there are people who are probably ready to find a new role because their current manager, has not helped them achieve their career goals. But it just kind of comes from a place where, if one is saying that in an interview context, the interviewer might think, well, is this a person that might feel that way in the not too distant future about this team as well? So really keep it positive and take the opportunity to show that, you may not like your current role or your current manager. That's maybe why you're looking for a new role. But use that as an opportunity to learn and grow, and maybe even talk about adversity in the role and how you are overcoming that and pursuing your career goals as well.
Absolutely, those some fantastic tips actually for everyone. I can't imagine prepping a 40-slide deck on myself. It must have taken a lot of time. Do you have any sort of like best experiences and anything that sticks out? Any story, any scenarios?
The best experience I ever had was that, if one goes out there and reads a lot about interview things, there's some great stuff on YouTube and stuff. Some different people will talk about the kind of the beginning, the middle, and the end of an interview. And usually the middle is about like a situational or behavioral question, a scenario-based question and such. And so the absolute best interview I ever had was when the interviewer actually took a problem that she was actually working through that week in her role. And she said that. She teed it up that way as like, I'm actually dealing with this problem right now. I have a meeting right after this that I'm going to go and try to solve this problem. Help, how would you solve this? How would you approach that? And I really liked that question because it all of a sudden it made me feel like I was contributing to her success, just like I was a team member of hers, even if I was still technically part of the interview and being considered for the role. But that, for some reason, that unlocked kind of an extra degree of passion in me. And we spent 25 minutes of that interview basically problem solving through the current challenge that she was facing. And that gave her the chance to learn from me, perhaps, and share some fresh thinking and ideas. And it gave me a chance to share my own passion, and it kind of unlocked my best self because I felt like I was solving something truly worthwhile. And so, yeah, I'd recommend that if you're an interviewer out there. Sometimes those real life or super relevant questions really matter. Yes.
Also, I think if we keep in mind that it's just a conversation, and if we try to base it on like reality and authenticity and what we actually do, and what we're actually working through, it's always going to be our best bet. Before wrapping up, Justin, I know you mentioned things of sort of like opportunities or these different programs we have here at Microsoft in terms of actually like maybe growing into a role at Microsoft and things like that. I don't know if you wanted to touch upon any of those things.
Yeah, certainly. There are tons of resources out there on careers.microsoft.com. That is basically where Microsoft publishes all of our job-related information. There's also some great videos on YouTube, by the way. I actually took an opportunity to go and see those myself prior to this stream, just to get a sense at what others were saying in Microsoft about the interview process. So really encourage you to check that stuff out. But beyond that, I think I would characterize it as there is always, I'll call it the standard process of applying for a job at Microsoft, right? You go and you see a job role, you upload your resume, you're contacted, selected, and such. And that's very, very important. That is where you're going to apply for roles, particularly as a professional and such. But in addition to that, what I think a lot of people don't realize is that Microsoft has some absolutely amazing programs that are specifically focused on career stages or other situational things. For example, we have a neurodiversity hiring program. We have military hiring programs, particularly in the United States as well. We have multiple flavors of internships ranging from high school to college to those that focus on business to those that focus on technical degrees. And so when you go to apply for a role at Microsoft, make sure that you've fully looked at all of those different programs before you apply through the standard process as well, and maybe do both. There's nothing that prevents you from doing both, but do really take advantage and look through those programs. They really make a difference. And some of the absolute best talent that I've had the honor of hiring and working with have come through some of those programs, the LEAP program, for non-traditional candidates as well. There's just so many amazing things there. And so please check that out. Share your feedback on what you want to hear from us. I think it's really important that we are hiring with inclusiveness in mind, and it's something we are striving towards. Certainly not perfect, and we have a long way to come in that matter, but it's something that we really are striving towards through some of these mini programs that we're doing.
Absolutely. I posted a bunch of links in the chat, and people can check out in terms of just educational content, but also, careers.microsoft.com, where you mentioned there's a couple of programs that I wasn't familiar up until you mentioned them today. So I'm going to go make sure to take a look at those so I'm even informed on whenever people ask how can I actually land a job or what kind of options we have and things like that. But this is fantastic. Justin, thank you so much. I know there's questions in the chat about social media and salary and things like that, but I think I'm going to get out of those and encourage Chloe and myself to sort of do a little bit more research and put on a session, like a topic specific on that one, because I think we could go way more in depth in that.
Yeah.
But I wanted to thank you, Justin, for spending this time with us. I'm sure we'll have a bunch of other questions. Are you on Twitter, or if people wanted to sort of keep an eye out for you?
Yeah, I am primarily on Twitter and LinkedIn at JustGar on both platforms as well.
Awesome. And if anyone has any questions, you could also just let me know, and I could probably bug Justin on a one-on-one or something.
you know where to find me, Gwyn.
Yeah. But yeah, I just there's a survey link on the screen, and I always encourage people to take these, because with the Reactor we have content all the time going on a bunch of different topics, but it's also the opportunity for y'all to let us know what kind of things you'd like to see, and just feedback in general. So do take that. The link is on the screen with the event ID and things like that. And again, Justin, thank you so much. Chat, thank you all so much. I will see you next week where we're covering whiteboarding. And yeah, thank you all.
Sounds good. Thank you all.